Hi, everyone. Welcome to Overthink. I am your host, Ellie Anderson, for this wonderful interview. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Dr. Ronald Levant, who is Professor Emeritus of Psychology at the University of Akron. Just a little backstory to this interview. Ron, you go by Ron, right? Is that okay if I call you that?
Yes, sure. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And welcome, by the way. I should at least let you say hi before I give the background.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you so much. So, yeah, the background that I just wanted to share with our viewers for this interview is that I drew, Ron, significantly on your work in one of my recent publications on hermeneutic labor, the gendered burden of interpretation and relationships between women and men. And you and I were both then quoted in a Washington Post article about this topic. You reached out to me, you were like, maybe we should talk. And I was like, oh my gosh, thank you for reaching out to me. I've been so into your work for a long time. And then it was such an immediate, it led immediately to me asking if you wanted to be on our YouTube channel for an interview. So I'll just give listeners and viewers a super quick intro to what I take to be, from an outsider's perspective, your most significant contribution to psychology, which is the concept of normative male alexithymia. And then we can go in some different directions from there. So you had a series of publications starting at least a couple of decades ago where you suggest that this clinical condition called alexithymia is actually the sort of default condition for men in our society. Alexithymia refers to a deficit in the cognitive and affective processing of emotions. So basically, one is unable to put emotions into words. And you suggest that this is a rampant subclinical condition that we see in mild to moderate form among men today. You now also have a forthcoming book. It's coming out just about right now. So if you're seeing this video, the day it comes out, you can order it. If you're seeing this video months later, you can order it as well. And the title of that book coming out with Routledge is The Assessment and Treatment of Emotionally Expressive Men. I am so excited about this book. And so tell us a little bit, about how, why do you think normative male alexithymia is a thing? Why is it such a rampant condition for men to have difficulty expressing their emotions?
Well, Ellie, thank you for the question and thank you for having me on this show. Let me correct that. I'm not entirely sure how prevalent it is.
Okay.
Yeah, so we can start with that. Um, uh, no prevalence, no epidemiological studies have been done in the US. One was done in Finland and quite some time ago. And to do this, you really need a stratified random sample of the entire population. And then you administer the standard measures and then you can take a base rate. But in Finland, the men, and by the way, there's a way for determining alexithymia. There's a clinical tool that has been validated with clinical patients. It's called the Toronto Alexithymia Scale 20 or the TAS 20, and it has cutoffs, and that's been incredibly useful. But in Finland, 17% of men and 10% of women meet criteria for clinical alexithymia.
Okay.
Now, clinical alexithymia is not the same thing as normative male alexithymia.
Mm-hmm.
That's another point I want to make. Clinical alexithymia goes further in specifying some traits that I don't think fit the normative male alexithymia, particularly something called externally oriented thinking and impoverished fantasy life. There really are two elements that normative male alexithymia has in common with alexithymia, and that is difficulty identifying emotions and difficulty describing emotions.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it's probably higher than that is the rate of normative male alexithymia. It's probably higher, but I wouldn't say it's rampant. However, I will say this. Whenever I give, a lecture or a talk, I always ask the audience, how many of you know a man who can't tell you what he's feeling? And all the hands go up.
Yeah.
So, and
Yeah.
for a man, when you ask him what he's feeling, he tells you what he's going to do
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
or what he's thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate you mentioning that. So I will say that I was taking the term rampant as a synonym for widespread. And so in an article that you published in 2001 on this topic, you did refer to the widespread inability among men to identify emotions and put them into words. But I really appreciate your point that that's different from saying that there have been like studies that have been done on this. And so as a psychologist, I understand that like those kinds of empirical measures are super important. And that's something that I, as a philosopher, am really appreciative of the psychologists who are actually doing studies on these types of topics. But so if we think about this widespread inability that you're describing, that I think anecdotally, certainly in a room full of people, we tend to see this always happens when I'm recording. A package comes for me. It was a book. I don't know if you just heard that. Sorry about that noise.
I didn't
But
hear
in any case, I think where was I going with this?
it.
Um, this idea that what I like about the term normative as you use it there is that you suggest that it has to do with the sort of scripts that boys are taught from a really young age. And I know you are both a researcher and a clinical psychologist. You've had a lot of experience working with actual patients. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about how this difficulty expressing emotions appears for men in ways that might have been generated through their upbringing. Like what do you think it is about society that leads to this kind of normative condition where we associate masculinity with an inability to express emotions?
Sure. So the term normative, in the way I thought about this, refers to social norms,
Hmm. Hmm.
in particular norms about how boys and men are expected to think, feel, and act, and even more importantly, about how they're supposed to not think, feel, and act. So these are respectively prescriptive and proscriptive norms.
Hmm.
And one of the norms of masculinity, that's really the version of masculinity. By the way, masculinity is a social construction that's embedded in culture, and it varies by culture and historical era. So the definition of masculinity hasn't always been what it is today. I'll just give you one example of that. One masculine norm today is restrictive, affectionate behavior between men. Men are not supposed to express affection to each other, physically or verbally. But in Abraham Lincoln's time, the opposite was true. Men hugged, kissed, and when they traveled to see each other in the 1850s, travel was a lot different. You didn't get in your Lexus and get on the interstate.
I don't know about you, but that's not my current situation. But point taken. I took the Greyhound bus last week.
Well, might have been more similar then.
Still nicer in any case.
But anyway, when men traveled to visit each other, they slept in the same bed. So these norms change. They're not built into the Y chromosome. And they're an anthropologist did a study, several decades ago, called Manhood in the Making, David Gilmore,
Mhm.
and he found all different ways that gender roles were expressed all across the world. So, it's not these gender roles or these gender norms, vary by culture is my only point.
Yeah.
And, one of the central norms is to restrict the expression of vulnerable and caring emotions. Vulnerable emotions are emotions that make us feel vulnerable, like fear and sadness, things of that nature. And caring emotions are expressing the need for another person,
Mhm.
and the only in traditional masculinity ideology, the most valued way to be a man is to never need anything from anyone. So both relational emotions and vulnerable emotions are ruled out. And boys, as early as elementary school, maybe in some cases in preschool, get the idea that the worst thing they can do is walk, talk, act, or throw like a girl. So they study what girls do and they don't do it. And girls are emotional and boys are not. And then, of course, boys who cry get particularly bad treatment, sometimes physical punishment, sometimes even getting beaten up. And have a little anecdote I want to insert about that because I in my practice, I often saw parents around a child problem. I'd work with the parents, and I was working with a couple who had a 7-year-old son, and they said, we're trying to raise our son to be free of all these gender norms. So we let him cry in the house, but we're worried about how he'll be treated out in the wider world. And I said, well, that's a really valid concern. And probably what you can do is inoculate your son about that. You can have a conversation with him in age appropriate language. Johnny, in our house, we think it's okay for boys to cry because boys have tear ducts, and crying, when you're sad makes you feel better. But not everybody agrees, and you have to be aware of who you're around, because if people feel that boys shouldn't cry and you cry in front of them, they might get mad at you. So you have this kind of conversation. I'm suggesting to the parents with their son to kind of let them know it's okay for boys to cry, but don't do it everywhere. Be a little careful as to who you're around, that kind of thing.
Wow. That's such a beautiful piece of advice, I think, because I hear people, including friends of mine who are parenting boys, asking and really worrying about what they can do to resist some of these norms. And I tend to be very unhelpful in these contexts because I am not a clinical psychologist. I'm a philosopher. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know. I think the structure fundamentally needs to change. And that includes gender roles, that includes the education system. And I think that's right. But obviously, that's not a helpful thing to say to a parent. And so I really appreciate this perspective that I think is much more helpful to the individual of possibly inoculating the child. How far do you think that can go? Like, do you think that can really help resolve some of these problems, and or do you think it really can only go so far because some of the messages that we receive via the media, via other interpersonal relationships, via institutions is going to get in our bones one way or another?
I think it helps some, but countering sort of the kind of the gender propaganda that exists in our society is a formidable task. Have you been into a toy store recently?
I have not, but tell me what you're seeing.
Well, it's totally segregated. The pinks and the blues. The gender norms permeate toy stores. The toys for girls and the toys for boys. Even walkers for toddlers are gender differentiated. A walker for a boy is a truck, of course. For toddlers, The walker for a girl is, guess what? A shopping cart.
Oh, wow. Wow. And then people are like, it's just so weird. Girls love clothes. It must be something in their biology.
No, it's pure social learning. And, that's, by the way, a fundamental it's a fundamental theory in psychology, social learning theory. I don't know if you've come across it, but
Just a
it's the
little bit.
idea that, basically, we learn about our environment and the world we live in, through a system of reinforcements and punishments from, basically for your child, from your parents, as well as modeling of certain behaviors. And so the entire psychology of men is really based on social learning theory and how boys are socialized into, conforming to these masculine norms, like restrictive emotionality. But let me just kind of get back to your original question. Actually, can I give you another anecdote?
Please. We
So,
love vivid examples.
Yeah, so back in the 80s, I mentioned I was at Boston University, And I had the opportunity to lead a community-facing project. BU at that time was in trouble with its neighbors, and they wanted some community-facing programs so that people in the community would realize the value of the university. So I got the opportunity to run something called the Fatherhood Project. And this was ran from 1983 to 1988, I believe, 88 or 89. And what it was, because I was aware at the time, my research was on the family, as you might have gathered from what I talked about my practice. And I was interested in the fact that there was all kinds of resources for moms about parenting, but none for dads. And I think it was assumed that dads weren't parents or they didn't do very much, which really was the case. I mean, if you go back to the 1960s, these time diary studies indicated that men increased their involvement with their children in response to their wives' employment 6 minutes a day, a tenth of an hour a day. That's how much. So that's what it was in the 60s. By the time of the 80s, I was in the Boston area, you started to see fathers carrying infants in chest packs, the snuggly packs or pushing strollers.
I was one of those 80s babies being carried by my dad in one of those little snugglies.
Oh, okay. All right. And so we got the bright idea, me and one of my graduate students, who was also my running partner. We were training for the marathon. And we had a lot of time. We'd go on these 10 or 15 mile runs rather. And we'd have time to chat. So we cooked up this project called Fatherhood Education. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah. And these are some of the original workbooks that were given out.
Oh, cool. Wow. Can you still get these, or are they out of print now? Or they were just for your projects?
They were not formally published.
I think we could still use these.
What's that?
I think we could very much still use these.
I think so. And so it was in one of these classes. Oh, one other detail about the class. So I also got a grant at that time, $35,000, which was a lot more money than it is today. And I spent nearly all of it on video equipment, because video equipment in the early 80s was the coolest thing you could have. And so I bought more video equipment than any sane person would ever want. And so when the men came into the lab, they'd see all this video equipment. Said, "Wow, these guys must have it really going on," and they'd be really impressed with our equipment. And so that's kind of how we sold the thing to them. We told them, "We'll teach you how to be a better dad, the way you might have learned to play a sport like tennis or golf. You'll do it, we'll videotape it, we'll watch the video, we'll analyze it, and we'll figure out how to do it better." Okay, during one of these classes, I noticed that one of the dads was visibly upset. And at that point, not knowing much about normative male alexithymia or even anything about it, I asked him, "Is something wrong?" He said, "Yeah, my son stood me up for a father-son hockey game last weekend." He was a divorced father, and so connecting with his son was obviously very important to him. So I said, "Well, this is where my lack of knowledge comes in." I said, "Well, how did you feel about that?" His response, "He shouldn't have done it."
Interesting. So not a feeling-based response, but a comment about what somebody else did. So it's action-based and other-oriented.
Exactly. Yeah. So I said, "Okay, let's role play this." And at this point, again, this is before I had even started to think about men's emotional expression. So I had him role play himself. I had another dad role play his ex-wife as she delivered the news that her son had forgotten about the date and had gone to another event. So we videotape this interaction. This is in this situation, you've got a camera, you've got a microphone coming down, camera on a tripod, and the two people are sitting fairly close together. And then we watch the videotape. And when the man playing his former wife delivers the news, his shoulders fall, slump, his face falls into a frown. And I'm trying to coach him. I said, well, look at your face in the monitor. What are you feeling? So he's scratching his chin like this and concentrating. He said, I don't know. And he says, I guess I must have felt disappointed. And I thought to myself, I'm just thinking in my head, I guess I must have felt disappointed with this
Yeah.
coaching. I thought, how might a mother feel in an analogous situation, like your daughter standing her up for a shopping date? Well, at first I was surprised because it's not like her to act that way. Then I was hurt that she acted with so little regard for my feelings. Then I was worried that maybe she was upset with me, and this is her way of showing it. And then in the final analysis, I was disappointed and annoyed because I built my whole day around it, and now it was ruined.
Wow.
So I'm in my head, I'm going, I guess I must feel disappointed versus surprised, hurt, worried, disappointed, annoyed. So I went back to the department, I think the next day, and I asked some colleagues, I told them what happened. I said, what do you make of this? And they said, well, Ron, women are just more emotional by nature.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's something that really interests me in my research, where I've talked about women's intuition as being a euphemism for hermeneutic labor, or the labor of interpreting emotions. And I think that that anecdote really illustrates this, right? It doesn't directly illustrate the gendered burden that I'm talking about in my article, but it shows the asymmetry of communicative efficacy between the two genders, like the two parents in this case. And so, what I'm really interested in is not only how this has negative effects on men, because it's hard to live life not being able to articulate your emotions, but also how this means that the labor of articulating emotions gets shunted onto usually women partners, because people need to be able to negotiate their emotions. They need to be able to figure out what's going on. And so when they can't do that themselves in these interpersonal contexts, it becomes somebody else who does that for them. In most cases, in these heterosexual contexts, it becomes the woman. And so I'd be really curious. We have time. Hopefully we have time for two quick more questions. But the first of the two for you is really, what do you think men who recognize this, they're like, shoot, I recognize that my inability to articulate my emotions is having a negative impact on a woman partner. This is something I see all the time with friends, with my relationships, like super well-intentioned guys who don't want to be this way. What can they do to help themselves? Like, obviously therapy comes up a lot, like going to therapy, but how can they become better hermeneutic laborers so that there's not such an asymmetry between the two genders?
Well, I spent about a decade trying to figure that out. And but that's actually the wrong way to express it. I spent about a decade experimenting in my practice, trying different approaches, and I came up with a thing I called alexithymia reduction treatment. It's a manualized treatment, and it meshes with any system of psychotherapy, and it only takes 10 to 15 minutes per session over about 6 sessions out of the typical 50-minute session. And it begins with psychological education to explain to the man why it is that he cannot articulate his emotions, yet his wife can. So I talk about gender role socialization and social learning and all that. And then I say, the first task in this is developing a vocabulary for emotion. So I'll tell them, between now and the next session, I want you to think of it as many words for emotions as you can. And then I'll obviously rely on men's competitive nature. And I'll say my last client came up with 30 words, and I bet this guy's going to come in with 31. And so
Oh
it's
gosh.
really, I've done this type of thing in groups, and then I'll write the words on a flip chart, and out of the 6 or 8 guys, you might get 30 words. 20 will be words for anger, pissed off,
Mm.
furious, annoyed, irritated. And then about 8 or 9 will be not emotions at all, but signs of stress, burnt out, zapped, burdened. Okay. And then maybe one guy will come up with one genuine emotion word like joy or sadness. And there'll be one single emotion word. So men's who are socialized, according to these norms, do not develop a good vocabulary for emotions. So that gets down to how do you even identify the emotions if you do not have words to label them with?
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Okay.
so develop the vocabulary.
Mhm.
Then I found it's easier to teach men to recognize emotions in other people than in themselves.
Mm.
So I teach them about the nonverbal expression of emotions, you know, facial expression, tone of voice, paralinguistic things like sighs, cries, and gas, body language. And then I say during the week, as you're talking to somebody, ask yourself as you're listening to them, by looking at their face or listening to their voice, what are they feeling when they're telling me this? So I get them to kind of focus on other people, to kind of think about emotions and how they're expressed. And then once they've mastered that task, and not everybody gets this in the same amount of time because people vary a lot,
Yeah.
then I ask them to begin to identify emotions in themselves. Now, some of the men I've worked with uh, are not even aware that they're having an emotion, but instead they're aware of sensation in their body
Mhm.
that is really the physiological component of the emotion. So they might talk about having butterflies in their chest, or feeling a tight band across their forehead, or feeling like their legs want to run away with them. So they'll describe a bodily sensation. Other men can identify the emotion. So it's a range. And I say, okay, during the next week, I'd like you to keep an emotional response log. When you think you're feeling an emotion or you have a bodily sensation that you think may be an emotion, write it down. Then ask yourself the question, who is doing what to whom, and how does that affect me?
Mhm.
Then go through your vocabulary list and pick out the word or words that connect the dots there that express the emotion. So an example might be, I was feeling butterflies in my stomach. I was expecting feedback on a report that I gave to my supervisor at 1 o'clock, and here it says 1:45, and I haven't heard anything. I'm going through the list. Yeah, apprehensive. I'm feeling apprehensive. Now, telling this to you, you might think this is like emotional kindergarten, and it
I don't know.
is.
Apprehensive is a nuanced emotion, but
Well, I mean, the steps may
yeah,
seem like
yeah,
is very basic, but don't forget these men as boys were discouraged,
yeah.
paying attention to their emotions. So they never got to learn naturally how to identify and describe them. So I'm in this technique trying to help them learn how to do that.
Yeah. This is it's so touching hearing you talk about this because men who are listening, you can try this at home and
Yeah,
or ask for alexithymia reduction treatment from your therapist
yeah,
because it is such a clear multi-step way, I think, to help enhance one's own ability to recognize emotions. And one thing that just crosses my mind a little bit is how this is actually strangely similar in an unexpected way to some of the activities that the Stoic philosophers advocated. Stoicism is huge right now in the manosphere and is associated with kind of ignoring your emotions. It's not actually what Stoicism is about. Stoicism requires what we would now call mindfulness and then sort of gently detaching yourself. So even though ultimately the goal for the Stoics is a kind of detachment, which is not necessarily something I would advocate, I do think there's a lot more to Stoic practices of self-cultivation that's really in line with what you're saying. I feel like we could talk for another hour. We do have to close. So I want to ask you in closing one question, sort of following up on what I just said, which is, what would you say to the following kind of man today? There are a lot of men who have found themselves drawn to Stoic thinking, to a lot of these like sort of manosphere oriented approaches that end up entrenching gendered norms that associate men with the absence of emotion and women with emotion. And that often has actually led to the resurgence of really reified gender norms, this idea that men are essentially this way, women are essentially this way. I'm not saying there's a direct pipeline from studying Stoicism to that at all, but I think often it's like the same kind of man that I see in my life who loves listening to these sort of manosphere oriented podcasts and then ends up finding themselves really in a position of like, oh yeah, maybe women should be in the kitchen and they should be doing the emotional and hermeneutic labor. I know you don't think that these masculine norms are biological at all. You think they're much more socialized. So what would you say to a man who might find himself being attracted to that kind of very conservative or traditional outlook?
Well, I would say we have to take a look at recent social history, going back to the 1950s. In the 1950s, very few women were in the labor force. They couldn't get a credit card. Mothers of small children were participated in the single digits in the labor force. By the 1980s, more than 50% of mothers of small children were in the workforce. It was a dramatic change in women's roles from the 50s to the 80s. But then the next thing that happened, starting in 1965 and going out to about 1985, was the divorce revolution. The divorces skyrocketed in this country and reached the point that half of all marriages were expected to end in divorce. And a little known fact is 2/3 of those divorces were initiated by the wives. So it makes sense. Once women gained financial independence from men, they left bad marriages in droves. And what happened during those decades and subsequently was there were generations of conversations between mothers and aunts and daughters and nieces about how to navigate in a changing world, a world of changing gender expectations. And so nowadays in my classes, they're mostly women. Men are not at the university, and as Richard Reeves has written, boys and men are doing more poorly than girls and women on nearly every educational, health, and social indicator you can imagine. And I think that's because while women changed their gender role dramatically from the 1950s to now, men have not. And then you get these influences on the manosphere doubling down on norms that go back to the immediate post-World War II period as if they're still relevant. And that is the reason, I think, that so many, and you get, Warren Farrell or Andrew Tate or Jordan Peterson, they're out there making millions of dollars on their books, telling men to double down on masculinity and tell that woman in your life what her place is, when she earns $200,000 and you're barely scraping by at 30,000.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, no, those were kind of the types of people that I had in mind. And I really love this message that you're leaving us with, which is in part just learn history. Like and that's not, and it's not sort of an ivory tower snobbish perspective. It's just like, look, if you're going to lean into this philosophical position, right, that suggests that these gender norms are fixed, then actually do your research on that and come to, the conclusion that this is dependent on very recent historical changes, not just on history, right? It's very cultural and social, but also just even a couple of generations ago, things would have looked very different. I'm so glad that you have this new book, Dr. Levant. I think your voice is needed now more than ever. And I was just so delighted to hear that this book is coming out. I cannot wait to read it. We're recording this before it comes out, but I cannot wait to read it. By the time it comes out, I will be starting on it, I'm sure. You can order it wherever you get your books, to those of you who are viewing. And thank you so much. This has just been such an incredible conversation.
Thank you for having me.